A storm was coming that the land had never seen the likes of. But that was not the cruelest thing that happened that winter. Picture a woman, gray-haired, 58 years old, standing alone on a frozen ridge, watching smoke rise from a house that was no longer hers. No one had thrown her out by force. It was quieter than that, colder than that. They had simply decided she was finished. And so she walked out toward the cliffs, out toward the place where people went to die. Behind her, the valley laughed at the foolish old woman in her hole in the rocks. Ahead of her, the first snow began to fall. What none of them knew, not the ones who cast her out, not the cruel man already riding to take the last thing she had, was that the discarded woman in the stone was about to become the only thing standing between all of them and the cold. The wind had not come yet. That was the strange part. The whole world lay still beneath a pale winter sky, and that silence pressed harder on the woman than any storm ever could. She stood alone on a low ridge above the wide grassland, a worn cloth sack hanging from one shoulder. Everything she still owned fit inside it. Everything that was left after a lifetime of work. Her name does not matter to the wind, but the people in the valley below had called her Cora Whitlock, and at 58 years old, she had just been turned out of the only home she had ever built with her own two hands. Behind her, a thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney of a small house. Her house. Not anymore. A cold breeze touched her cheek, soft as a goodbye. She did not turn around. If she turned, she might see her sister standing in the doorway, arms folded, eyes already looking past her towards something easier. If she turned, she might remember the years of rising before dawn, the cracked hands, the seasons given to that patch of stubborn earth. So she did not turn. She kept walking down the slope, away from the warmth, away from the smoke, away from the life that had decided it no longer had room for her. The frozen ground crackled beneath her boots. Winter was coming fast, and everyone in that country knew what winter did to a woman left alone before the first snow. Many such women never saw the spring. As she walked, a hawk circled high above the valley, riding the cold air without effort, patient, watching, waiting. The sight stayed with her, not because of the bird, but because of something her grandmother had once said, long ago, in the kitchen of a house that no longer stood. "The land will tell you how to live," the old woman used to whisper, "if you stay quiet long enough to listen." Cora had spent a lifetime trying to forget those words. Now they might be all she had left. By late afternoon, the cold had deepened. Long blue shadows stretched across the dead grass. The far hills had gone white and silent. She shifted the sack on her aching shoulder and kept moving. Most people would have walked north toward the town. There was shelter there, food, a charity house with a long line and longer stairs, a cot among strangers who would look at a gray-haired widow and see only a burden, a life spent waiting at someone else's door. Cora wanted none of it. She had spent enough of her life standing at doors that opened slowly, if they opened at all, so she turned west instead, toward a line of pale stone cliffs that most folks ignored. Just another wall of rock in a land already full of rock. But Cora remembered something hidden there. Months before, while hauling water on a hot afternoon, she had wandered farther than usual. And there, among the cliffs, she had found something. A cave, deep, quiet, carved into the stone by the patient hands of time. She remembered pressing her palm flat against the rock wall. It had felt cool, steady, unchanging, so different from the wild breaking weather of the open prairie. That memory came back to her now, clear as if it had happened that very morning. Her grandmother had shown her a cave like that once, in the old country, in a story told by candlelight. During a terrible winter, the old woman said, shepherds had survived inside the mountain, while the storms buried whole villages above them. She had tapped the table with one wrinkled finger and smiled a small, knowing smile. Wood freezes, child. Earth remembers warmth. As a girl, Cora had been too young to understand. She had only wanted the story, not the lesson. Now, at 58, with the cold creeping into her bones and her own family at her back, she understood every word. The sun was just touching the edge of the world when she reached the cliffs. The stone glowed orange in the dying light, the way embers glow before they go dark. She moved slowly from opening to opening. Some were shallow, some faced the wrong way, straight into the coming wind. Some were nothing but cracks too thin for a sparrow. And then she found it. The same cave, deep and wide, and turned away from the north, as if the mountain itself had built a shoulder against the storm. Cora stepped inside. The air changed at once. Out there, the evening cold cut through her thin coat like a blade. In here, the air was still, steady, almost kind. She walked deeper, her footsteps whispering against the stone. No wind, no rattling boards, no voices telling her what she was worth. Only silence. And for the first time in that long, terrible day, she stopped moving. The cave was empty. No bed, no fire, no food. Nothing a person could live on. And yet, standing there in the gathering dark, Cora felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been clenched tight for a very long time. The stone behind her felt solid, ancient, patient, as if it had been waiting for her all along. No one could throw her out of this place. No one could fold their arms in a doorway and decide she had become too much. No one could take this from her, because no one else had ever wanted it. Outside, darkness settled across the grassland, and that was when she saw it. Near the back wall, where the last gray light barely reached, something pale caught her eye. She moved closer, knelt slowly, knees protesting against the cold floor. There, half buried in dust and time, lay a few thin objects she could not name at first. A broken cup. A scrap of cloth gone stiff. The blackened ring of a fire that had burned out a few hard winters ago. Not long, but long enough. And beneath the cloth, something that made her breath catch. A single worn boot, cracked and curled stiff with cold, of a person who had come here once and had not left. Cora sat back on her heels. She understood now. She was not the first. Someone else had stood at the edge of winter with nowhere to go. Someone else had been turned out, told they were finished, told the cold was theirs to face alone. Someone else had found this same stone and crawled inside, hoping the earth would do what people would not. And the earth had not been enough to save them. A lesser woman might have run from that. A lesser woman might have called it a grave and fled back toward the town, toward the line, toward the cot among strangers. But Cora did not run. She reached out, and very gently, she covered the worn boot again with the stiff old cloth. A quiet kindness for a stranger she would never know. Then she whispered into the dark words that surprised even her. "I'm sorry no one came for you." A long silence answered her, and then something else rose in her chest. Not fear, not grief. Something harder, something with a spine in it. If the cold had taken the one who came before, then it would not take her the same way. She would not simply hide in this stone and wait to see if winter felt merciful. She would change it. She would make this forgotten cave into something no one in that valley would believe a discarded woman could build. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, drifting down slow and silent against the darkening sky. Cora pulled her coat tighter, pressed her back against the patient stone, and watched the last thread of daylight disappear from the mouth of the cave. Somewhere far below, a coyote called out across the empty land. And in the dark, alone, with the bones of a stranger keeping her company, the woman who had been left to die before winter began to plan how she would live. The first storm came 4 nights later. It arrived in the dark, the way the worst things so often do. Cora woke to a low sound rolling across the open land, a deep, rising moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. For one half-asleep moment, wrapped in her thin quilt, she thought it was thunder. Then she heard the snow. It hissed against the mouth of the cave like sand flung by an angry hand. She sat up fast. The quilt slid from her shoulders, and the cold reached for the place where it had been. Along the stone floor, a thread of icy air crept in and curled around her ankles. Beyond the thin tarpaulin she had wedged across the opening, the wind screamed across the cliffs. It rose, and it fell. Rose, and fell. Like something alive. Something out, hunting in the dark. Cora crept toward the entrance and pulled back one stiff corner of the cover. The world had vanished. There was no sky, no ground, no line between them at all. Only white, endless, racing white, tearing sideways through the night. She watched it a long moment, her breath clouding pale in front of her face. Most people, seeing a thing like that, would have felt only fear. And Cora felt fear too. She would not have lied about that. But underneath the fear, there was something else. Something quieter. Something that was almost like waiting to see if a promise would be kept. She let the cover fall back into place and stepped away from the opening. And here was the strange thing. The thing she would remember. Out there, the storm was tearing the whole world to pieces. But back here, deep in the stone, the air barely stirred. The roar dropped to a murmur, far away, like a memory of violence rather than the thing itself. The cold pressed and pressed against the rock, and the rock simply held. The cave did not fight the storm. It outlasted it. By the gray light of morning, the wind had worn itself down to nothing, and Cora sat against the back wall with her knees drawn up and a plan taking shape behind her tired eyes. The cave worked. She knew that now. She had felt it in her own body through one long howling night. But a cave that only kept her alive was not enough. Not for her. Not anymore. She did not want to survive the winter the way a hunted animal survives a hard season, shivering in a hole, counting the hours, hoping the cold forgot her name. She wanted to live in it. She wanted to build something so solid, so warm, so clearly hers, that no one who ever saw it could call her finished again. And so the real work began. It began before sunrise the very next day. And for a long time after, it did not stop. The little creek at the bottom of the cliffs gave her two things she could not do without: water and wood. Driftwood, fallen branches, the bleached gray bones of old trees carried down in some flood from a year nobody remembered. But the creek lay far below the cave, and every single load had to be carried up. The climb was steep. The rock was slick with frost in the early mornings, dark and treacherous where the sun never reached. By the third trip of the first day, Cora's shoulders were burning. By the sixth, her hands had begun to crack and split at the knuckles, and the cold got into the cracks and made them sting like fire. More than once, her boots slipped on the icy stone. More than once, she went down hard, scattering an armful of wood she had just gathered. And then she would sit there a moment in the snow, breathing. She was 58 years old. Her body reminded her of that with every step. Her knees, her back, the deep ache that lived now in her shoulders and would not leave. But she would get up. Every time she would get up. Because every branch she carried to the top was another hour of warmth. And every hour of warmth was another hour she was still here. Still standing. Still proving wrong every person who had ever decided she was through. She thought about a certain doorway sometimes when her legs shook beneath her, about folded arms, about eyes that had looked right past her. And she climbed. A few days into the work, a memory came to her. Out across the flats stood the ruins of an old survey shack, half fallen, its roof caved in years ago, its boards gone silver and soft with weather. Most folks would have walked right past it. Just a dead little building, sinking slow into the middle of nowhere. Cora looked at it and saw lumber. She saw a floor she could stand on instead of cold stone, shelves she could build, and a frame for a real door she could close against the night. So she walked out to it across the snow, and she pried the boards loose, one stubborn plank at a time, the rusted nails shrieking as they let go. Then she carried them back, 2 and 3 at a time, across the frozen grass, the cold wind pushing against her like a hand that wanted her to quit. It took days. It took more strength than she thought a woman her age still had in her. At night, she slept on the bare stone, and she listened to the wind moving along the cliffs, learning the shape of her new home. And each gray morning she woke stiff and aching and slow. And she rose anyway. And she started again, slowly then, so slowly she hardly noticed it happening day to day. The cave began to change. The first wall went up near the entrance, cottonwood poles for the frame, packed clay from the creek bank, dried grass twisted into the gaps. Where the wind found a way through, she sealed it tighter. Where a crack opened, she filled it, working the wet clay into the seam until her hands went numb to the wrist. And then she did something that, to anyone watching, would have made no sense at all. She built a second wall, deeper inside, a few feet back from the first. A neighbor, had she had one, might have shaken his head and asked why on earth a woman would spend her strength on 2 walls when one would surely do. But Cora remembered her grandmother's hands. She remembered her grandmother's voice, low and certain, in a warm kitchen, in a house that no longer stood anywhere in this world. Trapped air holds the warmth, child. Like a second blanket nobody can see. the space between the walls. That is what saves you. It was a lesson from the old country, from people who had outlived winters far crueler than this one, in low stone houses pressed into the sides of cold mountains. A lesson handed down through women, from grandmother to mother, to a girl who had once been far too young and far too restless to truly listen. Most people built houses. Cora was building something cleverer than a house. She was building a machine, a quiet engine of stone and clay and pure stubbornness, made for one single purpose: to fight the cold and to win. One evening, when the light was failing, she stepped back to look at what she had done, and for a moment she hardly knew the place. The cave no longer looked abandoned. It no longer looked like a hole where a worn-out woman had crawled away to hide. It looked claimed, not by paper, not by law, not by any man's permission, by work, by aching shoulders and split knuckles and a will that simply would not bend. And the feeling that rose in her then was something she had not felt in more years than she cared to count. For so long, other people had decided things: what she was worth, where she belonged, the exact moment she had become too much to keep. But every board in that wall answered to her now. Every stone, every handful of packed clay, they answered to no one else in the whole wide world. And that was its own kind of warmth. But warmth made of timber and clay would not be enough to carry a body through the deep heart of winter. She needed real heat. She needed fire. And fire was the hardest lesson her grandmother had ever taught her. For it, she needed tools she did not have: a saw, a hammer, something to cut and dig with that was better than her bare, frozen hands. So Cora made a hard choice, the kind that leaves a mark on a person long after the cold has gone. A few mornings later, a freighter's wagon came creaking along the old trail below the cliffs, the driver bundled up to the eyes against the wind. Cora walked down to meet it, and when the wagon groaned to a stop, she reached into the small pouch she kept always close against her heart, and she drew out the one thing she had carried with her through all of it: a thin gold band, worn smooth and pale by the years. Her wedding ring. She held it in her open palm for a long, long moment, and in that moment, the cold trail and the gray sky simply fell away. She saw a younger man's face, a man with rough, gentle hands and a quiet laugh that came up slow. A man who had a way of looking at her across a candle, across a table, across a whole hard life, as though she were the one steady, warm thing in a cold and uncertain world. A man who had spoken once of fields they would plant together, of children and their children after them, of a long, good life lived side by side beside a warm hearth, growing old without fear. A man the winter had taken from her, out on a frozen trap line, long before any of those soft promises ever had the chance to come true. The ring was the last thread between her and all of it, the last small proof that she had once been chosen, once been kept, once been somebody's whole entire world. The freighter looked at the gold band. Then he looked up at the gray-haired woman holding it out to him in the biting wind, and something in his weathered face went quiet and soft. "You sure about this, ma'am?" he asked. Cora did not trust her voice just then, so she only nodded once. He gave her what he had to trade for it: a saw with a cracked and mended handle, a worn hammer, its head loose on the shaft, A length of damaged canvas, stiff and patched, but whole enough to keep out a wind. It was not much, not by any honest measure, but it was far more useful now than memory had any right to be. She closed her fingers around the cold tools. He closed his around the warm gold. And as the wagon pulled away and grew small and then smaller against the long gray distance, Cora stood alone on the empty trail. She did not cry. She had done all her crying in another life. She simply turned and walked back up toward the cliffs, toward the work that was always waiting, and she did not once let herself look back at the place where the last of her old life had vanished into the cold. Some things a person trades because they have no other choice, and then they carry the missing of them quietly for the rest of their days. That night, by the small and steady light of her lantern, Cora began to build the fire system her grandmother had once drawn for her in cold ashes on a kitchen floor. It was not a campfire. It was nothing so simple or so wasteful. It was something older, something patient, a shallow pit dug down into the cave floor, a careful ring of flat stones laid close around it and partly over it, a narrow channel cut to draw the smoke up and away, out through a crack high in the rock, so the air she breathed would stay clean and safe. The stones were the whole secret of it. Wood burns fast, her grandmother used to say, tapping the table with one bent finger. It gives all its heat at once, and then it is gone, and you are cold again. But stone, child, stone drinks the fire slow, and long after the flame has died, the stone gives the warmth back to you, like a gift it had been keeping safe. Cora worked until her fingers would no longer bend to her will. The first night, it did not work. She struck her spark, and the fire caught. And then the smoke, instead of rising clean through the channel, came rolling back into the chamber, thick and stinging, until her eyes streamed, and she had to crawl to the entrance and gulp the freezing air outside. She knelt there in the cold, coughing, the failure heavy on her chest. But she did not give up. She studied the channel by lantern light. She found where it had narrowed. She widened it, and she angled the stones, and she remembered slowly the exact tilt her grandmother's hands had made in the air. And the second night, the smoke rose, up and out through the crack in the stone, exactly the way it was meant to go. The fire burned low and steady. The flat stones grew warm beneath her palm, and hours later, long after she had let the flame sink down to nothing but a red memory in the ash, Cora pressed her hand flat against one of those stones. It was still warm. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in more weeks than she could rightly count, the woman who had been left to die before winter smiled into the dark. The cold deepened after that. Out across the grassland, the season tightened its grip like a great slow fist closing. In the scattered homes of the valley, families fed their stoves all the day long and shivered through the nights regardless. Wood piles shrank to nothing. The cold found every crack and seam in every wall, patient and pitiless, looking for the weak places. But each morning, deep inside her stone, Cora woke to air that was steady and calm. The rock held the warmth. The walls trapped it close. The fire stones gave it back, slow and faithful, hour upon hour upon hour. The machine she had built with her own 2 hands was working. She had beaten the cold. But the cold, she would learn, was only the first enemy that winter sends. The second came quieter, and the second was hunger. And hunger does not knock politely at a person's door. She had carried what little food she could from the homestead, a small sack of flour, a crock of salt pork, a handful of dried beans, some wrinkled roots, a twist of tea leaves saved for the cold mornings. Each evening, by the warm glow of the firestones, she would lay it all out before her on the canvas and count it. And each evening, there was a little less to count. She ate carefully. She ate less than her body cried out for. She stretched every meal as thin as it would stretch, and then thinner still. But numbers do not lie, and these numbers were not kind. There was not enough, not nearly enough, for the long, dark heart of the season that was still to come. One night, she sat beside the warm stones with the nearly empty flour sack across her knees, and she stared into the shadows, and for the first time since she had gently covered that worn boot with an old cloth, the fear came back. The cave could keep her warm, but stone could not fill an empty belly. Warmth without food was only a slower kind of dying. Outside, the snow drifted quiet past the mouth of the cave, and somewhere in the dark behind her, the bones of the one who had come before seemed very near. The one who had found this stone, the one who had crawled inside, hoping the patient earth would be enough. The one for whom it had not been enough at all. Cora drew her knees up and wrapped her arms around them, small in the firelight. "What did you run out of?" she whispered into the dark. "Was it the wood, or was it the food?" There was no answer. There never was. But the question would not leave her be, and in the cold gray light of the next morning, that question sent her searching, for she had begun to think, if someone had truly tried to last a winter in this place, if they had stayed long enough to wear a path in the dust and burn that ring of fire, then they had thought about hunger too. They must have. A person who meant to live did not simply sit down and wait to starve. They put something by. They saved against the dark. Cora took up her cracked lantern, and she began to search the cave the way she never had before. Not as a shelter this time, as a story someone else had begun in this very dark, only a few hard winters before her. She ran her hands along the back wall, inch by patient inch. She moved the loose stones. She brushed away the gray dust. She crouched and she crawled, and she pressed her sore fingers into every seam and shadow she could find. For a long time, she found nothing at all. And then, in the deepest corner, where the lantern light grew thin and the ceiling dropped down low, her searching hand found an edge, a flat stone, set down into the floor, but set wrong, set on purpose. It did not belong to the natural shape of the cave. Someone had placed it there carefully and worked to make it look like nothing worth a second glance. Cora's heart began to pound against her ribs. She worked her fingers under the cold edge of it. She pulled. The stone resisted, then shifted, then slid aside with a low grinding sound that seemed very loud in all that silence. And beneath it, cut down into the cold, dark earth, was a small, dry hollow, a hidden cellar, no bigger than a washtub. Cora lifted the lantern with a hand that would not quite hold still, and she leaned close, and she looked. Inside, wrapped and sealed against the cold, lay the careful, loving work of a person who had been planning, with all their heart, to live. Strips of dried meat, hard as old wood but whole, packed tight in waxed cloth. A small clay jar of rendered fat, still sound in the deep cold. Bundles of dried roots and dark berries. And a little sack of seed grain, saved, surely, for a spring its owner had never lived to see. Cora sat back slowly on her heels in the trembling lantern light, and she pressed one cracked hand over her mouth. She understood it now. All of it. The one who came before had not failed for lack of trying. They had not been foolish, or weak, or careless. They had built. They had planned. They had put food away against the dark, exactly as a wise person would. The winter had simply been crueler than their strength could answer. The cold had come for them before the spring could come for them. But they had left this behind, a gift sealed in the stone, waiting in the dark, waiting through the cold years for whoever might come next and find this place and need it. One discarded soul reaching across the silence to keep another discarded soul alive. Cora's eyes filled and burned. She thought of the worn boot beneath the stiff old cloth. She thought of all the people in this world who were counted up and weighed and set aside. And she said, very softly, into the cold and patient dark, "Thank you." It was not a great deal of food. It would not make her rich. It would not make the long winter short. But it was enough. Enough to tip the cruel numbers. Enough to push the deep heart of the season from impossible down to merely hard. Enough, with care, to live. Cora sealed the little cellar carefully back up that day, and she took from it only what she truly needed, a little at a time, the way a person honors a gift they never expected and could never repay. And something in her changed after that. The cave had stopped being a hole she was hiding inside of. It had become a place that took care of its own. For a while, a short while, it almost felt like peace. But peace, in that hard country, was never a thing that was allowed to last. It ended on a still, bright afternoon when the snow lay clean and blinding white across the flats, and the sky overhead was a high and frozen blue. It ended with the sound of horses. Cora heard them before ever she saw them, the crunch of shod hooves on packed snow, the creak of fine saddle leather, the low, easy voices of men who had ridden out from somewhere warm, who had eaten well that very morning, who had never once in all their lives stood at a closed door and waited to learn what they were worth. She stepped out from behind the tarpaulin, and she stood at the mouth of her cave, and she watched 3 riders come picking their slow way up toward the cliffs. 2 of them hung back. The third rode forward, alone. He was a broad man in a heavy, well-made coat, his clean-shaven face gone red at the cheek from the cold, his hat worth more than every single thing that Cora owned in the world. He sat his horse the way certain men sit everything in their lives, as though it already belonged to them, and always quietly had. He drew up a few paces from the cave mouth, and he looked down at her. He looked at the walls she had raised, the thin, clean smoke rising from the crack in the rock, the 1,000 small signs of a place lived in, and tended, and loved. And his mouth curled into something that was almost a smile, but was not, in any way, kind. "Well," he said, "so the stories were true after all." Cora said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that silence costs a person nothing, and tells a certain kind of man far more than he ever means to give away. The name is August Pell, he went on, when she would not fill the quiet for him. And you, I believe, are the woman who's been squatting in my cliffs. Your cliffs, Cora said. It was not a question. It was a slow, flat thing, laid down between them in the snow like a stone. Pell's almost smile widened by a degree. These cliffs, and more than that. That creek down below. He gestured with one gloved hand. The only water that runs sure and deep for a day's ride in any direction. A drought summer, every soul in this country would have to come, hat in hand, to whoever holds it. He leaned on the saddle horn. Folks look at these rocks and see worthless stone. I see the one well a whole valley can't live without, and all of it comes under my name, come the spring. The papers are very nearly drawn up, and a clever woman living in a hole in the ground. He let the words hang there in the cold. Is not a part of my plans. Cora felt the chill of it settle deep into her chest, but she did not let it reach her face. I've taken nothing that anyone wanted, she said. I found a forgotten place, and I made it live. That is not squatting, Mr. Pell. That is work. That, said Pell, is a matter for the law to decide. And the law, out here in this country, he spread his gloved hands wide. The law has a way of agreeing with whichever man can pay it best. The two riders behind him said nothing. They only sat and watched, the way hired men watch a thing. And then Pell leaned forward in his fine saddle, and something cruel and lazy and amused came creeping into his eyes. You know, he said, softer now, you really ought to save your anger for your own people, not for me. Cora went very, very still. What did you say? Oh, said Pell, and now the smile was real, all the way through, because his cruelty had finally found the soft place it had been hunting for. You don't know. Of course you don't. He settled back, and he savored it. Who do you imagine pointed me toward this valley in the first place? Who do you suppose signed away her share of the family ground in trade for being kept well clear of the trouble that was coming? He tilted his head. Your own sister, woman. She sat at my table. She heard my terms, and she put her name down right there beside mine. The whole white world seemed to tilt slowly beneath Cora's feet. That is a lie, she said, but her voice had lost its stone, and they both heard it go. Is it now? Pell shrugged, careless and warm and content. She's the one who told me you'd gone off into the rocks to die somewhere quiet, and spare everyone the bother of you. She seemed... He searched for the word and found the worst one. Relieved that you'd gone and made it so easy. He gathered up his reins. You weren't put out into the cold by some accident, ma'am, he said, and he said it almost gently now, which was the very cruelest thing of all. You were cleared away, like brush off a field, so that the deal could go through nice and clean. He turned his fine horse in the snow. Enjoy your stone, he called back over his shoulder, while it's still yours to enjoy. And the three riders went picking their careful way back down the long slope, their voices low, their laughter carried thin and bright across the frozen air. Cora did not move. She stood at the mouth of the cave she had built with her own bleeding hands, in the place where a long-gone stranger's kindness had reached out to keep her alive. And she felt the whole ground of her life shift and groan beneath her. She had believed that she had simply been forgotten, that she had only become too much, too old, too tired, too much trouble for anyone to go on keeping. And that was a wound, a deep one, but it was a wound a person could learn to carry. This was something else entirely. She had not been forgotten at all. She had been chosen against, counted up and weighed and sold, so that a deal could go through clean. The folded arms in that distant doorway had not been weariness. They had been a price agreed upon. Cora pressed one hand flat against the cold stone beside the entrance, the way she had that very first day, reaching for the steadiness of it. The rock held, the way it always held. But somewhere deep inside her chest, something that had only been broken before began, very quietly, to burn. For 3 days after the riders left, Cora did not feel the cold. The anger kept her warm. It moved through her like a second fire, low and steady and dangerous. And she fed it the way she fed the hearthstones, carefully and without waste. She did not weep over what her sister had done. There would be time for weeping, perhaps, in some softer season that might never come. For now, there was only the work, and the work had changed. Before, she had built to survive. Now, she built to last. She drove the door frame deeper into the stone. She doubled the clay along the seams. She hauled more wood up that brutal slope than her body had any right to carry, until the store of it climbed the back wall in neat, defiant rows. If August Pell believed a gray-haired woman in a hole would simply wither when the winter pressed, then August Pell did not know what kind of woman he had threatened. "You want this stone," she said one night, to no one, to the dark, to the man who was not there. "Then you'll have to wait for the winter to do your work. And the winter and I, we have an understanding." The firestones glowed. The walls held the warmth. And outside, the cold went on tightening, night after night, like a thing with patience and no mercy in it at all. It was on one of those black, bitter nights that the knock came. 3 blows against the stiff tarpaulin. Then silence. Cora froze where she sat. No one knew she was here. No one came up to the cliffs in the dead heart of a freezing night, not unless they were lost or desperate. The wind pushed a hiss of snow across the entrance, and again the knock came, slower this time, weaker, as though whoever stood out there in the dark had spent the very last of their strength on it. Cora rose. She took up the loose-headed hammer she kept always beside her bed, and she crossed the floor on quiet feet, and she stood close to the covered opening. "Who's there?" she called. No answer came back to her, only breathing, heavy, ragged, uneven. The breathing of a person whose body has begun, quietly, to give up. Cora drew back the cover, and a man pitched forward out of the dark and fell across her threshold into the firelight. Snow caked his heavy coat. Ice hung in white beads from his beard. His face had gone the gray of old ash, and his lips had the blue tinge that the cold leaves on a person it has nearly finished with. For one long, terrible moment, Cora thought he was already dead. Then she saw his chest move. Barely. Once, the man's lips parted, and out of them came a single, cracked word. "Please." That was all. Cora did not think. There was no thinking left to do. She seized the man under the arms and dragged him in across the stone, out of the wind's reach, and the cover fell shut behind him, and the screaming of the night was suddenly gone, swallowed by the deep, patient quiet of the rock He was a big man, far bigger than she was. The effort of moving him left her breathing hard, her old shoulders screaming. But she got him to the warm stones, and then the long fight began. The same fight a stranger had once lost, in this very dark, not so many winters ago. His boots were frozen solid. His hands, when she peeled back the stiff leather of his gloves, were white, bloodless, hard as carved things. Every instinct a person has screams, in such a moment, to warm them fast, to press them to the fire, to rub the life back into them with brisk and hopeful hands. And every one of those instincts is wrong. Cora knew that. Her grandmother's voice came to her, clear across all the years, as it always did in the moments that mattered most. Slow, child. Always slow. Bring a frozen thing back too fast, and you kill it twice. So Cora did not rush. She heated water, but only until it was barely warm. She wrapped his ruined hands in cloth dipped in that gentle heat, and changed the cloth as it cooled, and changed it again. She worked the frozen boots from his feet, and warmed those the same slow way. She did not press him to the flame. She let the patient stones do their patient work. She watched. She waited. Hour after hour, deep into the night, while the wind hunted the cliffs outside, and the fire stones gave back their hoarded warmth. And somewhere near the bottom of that long, dark night, the stranger's breathing changed. It steadied. It deepened. The gray began very slowly to leave his face. Near the hour when the dark is heaviest, the man opened his eyes. For a moment there was nothing in them but confusion. Then his eyes moved. They traveled the walls, the clay-packed seams, the neat rows of wood, the hearth of fitted stone, the order and the care and the cleverness of all of it. And something came into his face then that Cora had seen before. It was the look a person wears when they understand all at once that they have been entirely wrong about something. You? His voice was a dry rasp. He swallowed and tried again. You built this? Cora nodded once. His eyes moved over it all again, slower this time. By yourself? Again she only nodded. A small sound escaped him. Not quite a laugh. More like the breath a man lets out when the world has surprised him past his ability to hide it. I came up here, he said slowly, expecting to find a poor old woman freezing in a hole. He let his head fall back against the warm stone. And instead, I find this. Cora studied him in the firelight. And what? She said quietly. Made a man come looking for a poor old woman freezing in a hole on the worst night of the winter. The stranger went still, and Cora, who had spent a lifetime learning to read the small movements of people's faces, saw the truth pass behind his eyes before he ever opened his mouth. She saw him decide whether to lie, and she saw him choose, instead, to tell it. My name, he said, is Elias Marsh. He drew a slow breath, and it seemed to cost him. And I was sent here to find you. The warmth in the cave did not change, but something in the air between them did. Cora's hand drifted toward the hammer on the floor beside her. Sent, she repeated. By whom? Elias closed his eyes, as though saying it was a kind of pain. By a man named August Pell. The name landed in the quiet like a stone dropped down a well. Cora's fingers closed around the hammer's handle. Then you'll forgive me, she said, and her voice had gone cold and flat and careful. If I don't trust the breath in your body. You shouldn't, Elias said. Not yet. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and there was no excuse in them, no pleading, just a tired, honest weariness that was harder to distrust than any clever lie. Reach inside my coat, he said, the inner pocket, left side. Cora hesitated. Then, keeping the hammer near, she reached into the heavy, half-thawed coat. Her fingers found a folded packet of papers, sealed against the weather in oiled cloth. She drew them out. She unfolded them by the firelight, and her breath caught. She could not read every word, but she knew the shape of what she was looking at. Maps of the cliffs, of the creek, of the very ground she stood upon, and there, marked plain across the drawing of the stone she had made her home, a single hard word: occupied. A scout's report, a spy's report, drawn up to tell a powerful man exactly what stood between him and the land he meant to take. He hired me to come up here, Elias said, his voice low and steady, to find out whether the stories were true, whether there was really a woman living in these rocks, how well she'd dug in, how hard she'd be to... He stopped. To clear out, Cora finished for him. Yes, he said. Those were his words, not mine. But yes. The fire cracked softly. Cora sat back, the papers in one hand, the hammer in the other, and the bitter laughter of it rose in her throat. So, she said, I dragged Pell's own spy in out of the cold, warmed his hands, saved his miserable life, so that he could finish drawing the map that helps that man take the one thing I have left. You did, said Elias quietly. That's exactly what you did. And then he said the thing she did not expect. And I'd understand, he said, if you put me back out in that storm right now, I would. A man who does what I came to do has earned worse than the cold. Cora studied him. She had expected him to beg. She had expected excuses, the slippery words of a man caught in a low thing. She had not expected this flat, tired ownership of it. Then tell me, she said slowly, why? A man takes a job like that for money. But a man doesn't ride into a storm that could kill him for money. Not unless something's driving him harder than a wage. For a long moment, Elias Marsh said nothing. He looked into the fire, and the firelight found the lines in his face, and Cora saw that they were not only the lines of cold and age, they were the deeper lines, the kind that grief presses into a person and never quite smooths away. I took Pell's money, he said at last. That's true. A man has to eat. He paused. But that's not why I came up here tonight. He turned his head and looked at her. I came, he said, because of what the stories said about you. Cora frowned. What stories? They talk about you, down in the valley. A faint, sad ghost of a smile touched his mouth. A woman who walked off into the rocks to die, and didn't die. A woman who built herself a warm house out of cold stone, when everyone said she was finished. He shook his head slowly. But that's not the part that brought me. That's not the part I couldn't stop hearing. Then what was? They say, he said, that the woman in the cliffs never turns anyone away. The fire popped. The shadows shifted on the stone. They say no soul that's ever made it to her door has been sent back out into the dark. He swallowed. And I needed to know if that was true. I needed it to be true. More than Pell's money. More than my own neck. Why? Cora said again. but softer now. And Elias Marsh told her, "Because once," he said, "a long time back, in a winter as hard as this one, there was a family came to my door. In the night, in the cold, lost and freezing and begging to be let in." He stopped. His jaw worked. "And I didn't open it." The wind hummed along the cliffs. "I had my reasons," he went on, the bitterness all turned inward, on himself. "Good reasons," I told myself. "I didn't know them. Times were hard. A man has to look out for his own first. All the reasons a frightened person gives himself for keeping a door shut." He drew a long, unsteady breath. "They didn't make it through the night," he said. "The cold finished what my shut door started." The silence in the cave was a deep and heavy thing. "I've carried that," Elias said, "every winter since. Every time the wind comes up at night, I hear that knocking." He looked at his bandaged hands. "I told myself, if I ever heard of a person who did the thing I couldn't do, who kept the door open, I'd go and see it with my own eyes. Just to know it was possible. Just to know a person could be better than I was." He looked up at her. "So when Pell offered me money to go find the woman in the cliffs," he almost laughed and it broke in the middle. "I didn't take it for him. I took it for me. To come and stand in front of someone who keeps the door open, even now. Even when the whole world's told her to shut it." Cora sat very still. The hammer was still in her hand, but she had forgotten it was there. She looked at this broken stranger she had pulled in out of the dark, and she understood suddenly that the cold was not the only kind of winter a person could be left out in. Some people froze on the outside, and some people had been carrying the cold around inside them for years, looking for one warm door to prove the world wasn't only ice. Slowly, Cora set the hammer down. "You drew his map," she said. "I did." "And what will you do with it now?" Elias reached out one bandaged hand. He took the folded papers from her. He looked at them a long moment in the firelight, and then he leaned forward, and he fed them, slow and deliberate, into the hearth. The flames took the maps, the cliffs, the creek, the cruel, hard word. All of it curled and blackened and rose away as smoke through the crack in the stone, up into the night, gone. "I'll tell him I found nothing worth his trouble," Elias said, watching it burn. "I'll tell him the woman's near dead, and the place is falling in, and the winter'll do the job for him by spring." He turned to her. "It'll buy you time, not forever, but time." Cora watched the last of the papers turn to ash. "And why," she said, "should I believe a word of it?" Elias Marsh looked at her, steady and tired, and finally, somehow, at peace. "You shouldn't," he said. "Not yet. Belief like that has to be earned." He nodded toward the door, toward the storm, toward the long, cold weeks still ahead. "So let me earn it. Put me to work. You've got a place worth keeping, and one old set of hands keeping it. Let me be the other set, and by the spring, you'll know what I am." Cora was quiet for a long time. Then she reached over and laid another length of wood across the fire. "There's an empty corner there," she said. "You work, you eat. You don't work, you don't. That's the whole of it." Elias closed his eyes. Something eased out of his big frame. "Fair enough," he said. "Slow," Cora added as he tried to shift his weight and winced. "Those hands of yours aren't right yet. You move slow for a few days, or you'll lose fingers. There's been enough lost in this place already." "Slow." Elias agreed softly. Always slow. And Cora almost smiled at that. Almost. The days that followed were quiet ones, working ones. Elias healed. His hands came back to him, stiff but whole, and he was true to his word. He hauled and he sealed and he stacked, and he asked for nothing, and slowly, carefully, the way a person warms a frozen thing, a kind of trust began to grow in that stone room. Not friendship yet. The wary respect of two people who have each been left out in the cold, recognizing it in one another. But peace in that hard country was never allowed to last for long. And one gray morning, Cora woke knowing something was wrong. She did not know how she knew it. She only knew it the way her grandmother had always claimed to know it, the way the old shepherds in the old country were said to know it, in the bones, in the blood, in some deep animal place beneath all thought. She rose, and she pulled back the cover, and she stepped out into the morning, and she stood very still. The sky was wrong. It was not the clean, hard blue of a cold, clear day. It was not the soft gray of an ordinary snow. It was a strange and sickly color, low and heavy, a yellow-gray bruise spread across the whole vault of the world. The light that came through it was thin and queer, and it lay across the white land like the light at the bottom of deep water. And the silence. That was the worst of it. There were no birds, not one. There were no tracks of any living thing on the fresh snow. The wind, which had hunted the cliffs for weeks, had dropped away to nothing at all. The whole vast land held its breath, as though it had seen something coming on the edge of the world, and gone quiet in dread of it. Elias came to stand beside her in the cave mouth. "I don't like the look of that," he said quietly. Cora said nothing for a long moment. She pressed her hand to the cold stone of the entrance, the way she always did, and she listened, the way her grandmother had taught her a lifetime ago, to a land that was trying very hard to tell her something. "It's coming," she said at last. "What's coming?" Cora turned and began moving back inside, already counting wood in her head, already checking seams. "Something bigger than anything we've seen yet," she said. "Check every wall. Bring in every stick of wood that's out there. Fill every vessel that holds water." She looked at him. "And do it fast." Elias studied her face, and whatever he saw there, it was enough. He did not argue. That night, Cora stood alone at the mouth of her cave for a long while before she slept. The bruised sky had gone dark, but out at the very edge of the world, low along the line where the white land met the black sky, something was moving, a pale wall, faint and far and wide as the whole horizon, and it was coming. Slowly, for now, the way a great beast gathers itself before it springs. Cora watched it. The woman who had been left to die before winter watched the thing the winter had been saving, all this time, for last. And very softly, she spoke into the dark and waiting air. "The land's trying to tell us something," she said. She let the cover fall, and it's telling us to be ready. The great storm did not arrive the way the others had. The others had come like thieves in the night, sudden and loud. This one came like a king. It announced itself first as a change in the light. All through that strange, still morning, the sick yellow-gray of the sky had deepened, hour by hour, until the world seemed lit by no sun at all. only by some cold and sourceless glow that had no warmth in it anywhere. Then came the cold. A cold that was different in kind, not only in degree. A cold with teeth. And then, far off, came the sound. A low and rising roar, deeper than the earlier storms, older, the sound of the whole horizon getting to its feet. Cora and Elias stood together at the mouth of the cave and watched it come. Out across the white land, the pale wall she had seen at the world's edge had grown. It filled the sky now from end to end. A churning, towering, advancing thing, swallowing the land beneath it as it came. It ate the far hills first. They simply vanished as though they had never been. Then it ate the middle distance. Then it began, with terrible patience, to eat the plain that lay between it and the cliffs. In your whole life, Elias said quietly, have you ever seen the like? No, Cora said, and that single word, from a woman who had survived so much, was heavier than any speech. She turned from the doorway. Inside, she said, now, and bring the cover down tight behind us. They had done all they could to prepare. The wood was stacked high. The vessels were full. The seams were packed and double packed with clay. The fire stones held their patient heat. But as the roar grew, until it was no longer a sound out there but a pressure all around them, Cora understood that all her cleverness might not be enough. This was not a storm to be outweighted. This was a storm to be survived. And then it struck. The world outside disappeared into a single screaming whiteness, and the wind hit the cliffs with a force that Cora felt come up through the soles of her boots, up through the living stone itself. The tarpaulin snapped and bucked like a wild thing. Snow drove sideways through the smallest gaps. Cora and Elias worked without words, bracing the cover, packing fresh clay into every place the wind found, feeding the fire just enough, never too much, the way the stones liked it, and the great machine of clay and rock and stubbornness that a discarded woman had built with her own bleeding hands held. The wind threw itself against the cliffs and screamed and tore, and could not get in. The cold pressed and pressed, and could not reach the heart of the stone. Hours passed, and inside, the air stayed warm and steady and alive. Cora pressed her hand to the wall. Hold, she murmured to it. Just hold. And the stone held. It was deep in that first terrible night that the knocking began, not the wind. Cora knew the wind's 100 voices by now. This was different. A fist, beating, frantic, against the bucking cover, and beneath the roar, thin and torn and nearly lost, a voice. Please, is anyone there? For pity's sake, is anyone there? Elias was already moving toward the entrance, but Cora caught his arm. For one breath, she stood frozen. And in that one breath, the whole bitter shape of her life rose up before her. These were the people of the valley, the people who had let her be put out into the cold without a word, the people who had laughed at the foolish old woman who'd gone to live in a hole in the rocks, the people who had decided, every one of them, that she was finished. And now the storm had come for them, and they were beating on her door. It would have been so easy, so very easy, to stand in the warmth she had built with her own hands and listen to the cold take the ones who had let the cold take her. A small, hard voice somewhere inside her whispered exactly that. Let them learn, it said. Let them learn what it is. But then another voice came, older, warmer, coming up through all the years from a kitchen that no longer stood. You never close the door, child, not on a soul in the cold, not ever. Because the day you do is the day you become the very thing that put you out. Cora let go of Elias's arm. Open it, she said. And the door came open, and the storm came roaring in, and out of the white chaos, a figure fell across the threshold, and then another behind it. A man and a woman, caked in ice, blue-lipped, half dead on their feet. Cora knew them. They had a small holding out on the flats. The man had once turned his back on her at the trading post, made a show of it, so his friends could see him do it. Now he lay on her floor, weeping with the pain of the cold, unable to do anything but shake. Cora looked down at him for one long moment. Then she knelt beside him, and she reached for the warm cloth, and she began, the slow way, to bring him back to life. That was only the beginning. For all through that long howling night, and the gray nightmare day that followed it, and the night after that, they came. The storm drove them to the cliffs like leaves before a flood. A freighter, his wagon lost, his team scattered. 2 young brothers caught out moving cattle. An old man, alone, who had simply followed the faint glow of smoke he saw rising from a crack in the rock, and could not believe, even as he was pulled inside, that warmth could exist in such a place. They came, and they came, and the cave that one woman had built for one woman filled with the bodies and the breath and the fear of all of them. And not one of them was turned away. Cora moved among them like something the firelight had made. She doled out the dried meat from the hidden cellar, a little to each, the gift of a long-gone stranger passing now to a dozen frozen hands. She taught them, sharply, to warm their fingers slow, and slapped away the hands of those who reached too fast for the fire. "Slow," she barked at a young man cradling white fingers toward the flame. "You warm them fast, you lose them. Slow, or not at all." And they listened to her. These people who had laughed at her. These people who had decided she was finished. They listened now as though her every word were the difference between living and dying. Because it was. Elias caught her once, passing close. "Half these folks wouldn't have crossed the road for you a season ago." "I know it," Cora said, not slowing her hands. "And you're spending your own food on them, burning your own wood, the wood that's meant to keep you alive. I know that too." He looked at her a moment longer. "Why?" Cora paused then, just for a breath. She looked around the crowded cave, at all the gray, frightened faces glowing in the light of the fire she had built. "Because a door that only opens for the people who deserve it," she said, "isn't mercy. It's just trade." And she went back to her work. It was on the second night of the great storm that they found the child. One of the young brothers, going out only as far as the mouth of the cave for wood, came stumbling back through the cover, white-faced and shouting over the roar. "There's something out there, down the slope. I heard a voice. I swear it." Cora was at the entrance in an instant. She knew, even before she looked, what the sane thing to do was. To stay inside. To keep the door shut against the killing white. No one should go out into that. But Cora had stopped doing the sane thing a long time ago. "Rope," she said to Elias. "Tie it to me. and hold it. You'll not go out in that, Elias said. I'll go. You're bigger and stronger, and I need you holding the line so we both come back, Cora said, already knotting the rope around her waist. Now hold it. And before he could argue, she pushed through the cover and out into the storm. The white swallowed her whole. There was no up, no down, no direction at all. Only the screaming wind and the ice driving into her face like 1,000 small knives, and the rope at her waist, the one thin thread back to the warm world. She did not walk. She crawled down the slope into the teeth of it, calling out into a roar that ate her voice the moment it left her mouth. She found the wagon first, a dark shape looming sudden out of the white, half buried, abandoned. And there, sheltered in the lee of one great wheel, curled into the smallest shape against the cold, a child, a girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, so still, so pale, that for the second time that winter, Cora's heart stopped at the certainty that she had come too late. She gathered the little one up into her arms. The child was terribly cold, but when Cora pressed her cracked old cheek to the small blue lips, there was breath, faint, but there. "I've got you," Cora said into the storm, though no one could hear. "I've got you. You're not staying out here. Not you." And she turned, and she followed the rope back up through the screaming white. The child clutched against her chest, hauling them both hand over hand toward the faint, warm glow that meant the door was still open. Elias pulled them the last of the way in, and the cover fell shut, and the storm was outside again, and Cora knelt on the warm stone with the freezing child in her arms and began the slowest, most careful fight of all. The little girl's name, they would learn, was Wren. She had been traveling with kin who had hoped to outrun the weather. The wagon had broken an axle. The grown folks had gone for help and had not come back, and the child, doing as she was told, had stayed with the wagon. And the wagon had become her tomb, very nearly, out there in the white. Cora did not leave her side for hours. She warmed her by inches. She held the child against the heat of her own body and rocked her, slow, the way a woman rocks a thing she has decided is hers to save. And somewhere in the deep of that long night, the child's eyes fluttered open. She looked up, lost and frightened, into the face of a gray-haired stranger in the firelight. "Am I dead?" the little girl whispered. And Cora, who had not wept once through all of this, felt her old eyes sting at last. "No, child," she said softly. "No, you're warm. You're safe. And no one is going to put you back out in that cold. You have my word on it." The little girl looked at her a moment longer. Then she did a thing that broke something open in Cora's chest. She reached up one small thawing hand, and she took hold of a fold of Cora's worn sleeve. And she held on, the way a child holds to the one safe thing in a world that has frightened her past words. And she closed her eyes, and she slept. Cora sat very still, so as not to wake her. The child's small hand stayed knotted in her sleeve, and the woman who had been told she was too old, too tired, too much trouble to keep, sat in the heart of the storm with a sleeping child holding fast to her, and understood something she had forgotten she knew. That she had so much left to give, that she had never, for one single day, been finished at all. The third night was the hardest. The storm did not weaken. The cave was full now, near to bursting, 24 souls packed close in the warmth, and the wood was burning faster than one woman had ever planned for, and the water was running low, and the air had begun to feel close and thin. Cora rationed everything, counted everything, stretched everything, and held the whole fragile world of that cave together by the sheer force of her will. It was in the worst of that third night that the knocking came again, but this knock was weak, so weak that under the roar of the storm it was nearly nothing at all. The faintest, failing brush of a hand against the cover. Elias reached it first. He drew it back, and a figure half fell, half crawled across the threshold, and lay there in the firelight, too spent to rise. A woman. Cora crossed the floor. She knelt to help. She reached out to brush the snow from the fallen woman's face, to see who the storm had brought her this time. And her hands went still. She knew this face. She had known it all her life. She had seen it as a child's face, laughing across a shared bed, as a young woman's face, standing up beside her at her wedding, and she had seen it, last, as a hard and folded face in a doorway, looking past her toward something easier. It was Vera, her sister, the one who had sat at August Pell's table, the one who had signed her name, the one who had told a powerful man that Cora had gone off into the rocks to die quiet, and seemed relieved that she'd made it so easy. The whole cave seemed to go silent, though the storm still roared. Cora knelt frozen above her sister, and the old hard voice rose up in her again, hot with everything that had been done to her. This one. This is the one you owe nothing to. This is the one who sold you. Let the storm have her. It would only be fair. Vera's eyes opened. They found Cora's face, and the recognition came into them, and behind it came a terror that had nothing to do with the cold. "Cora," she breathed. It was barely a sound. "Cora, I didn't know where else." She could not finish. She did not need to. Both of them knew in that long and terrible moment exactly what the just thing would be, exactly what Vera had earned, and every soul in that cave watched and held their breath and waited to see what the woman they had wronged would do to the sister who had wronged her worst of all. Cora looked down at Vera, at the gray in her sister's hair that she had never noticed before, at the lines of hard years in a face she had once known better than her own, at the fear and the shame and the cold, all written there together. And the old hard voice told her, one last time, to close the door. Cora closed her eyes. She thought of a kitchen that no longer stood, of an old woman's hands, of a rule that had survived crueler winters than this one. You never close the door, child. Not even on the ones who closed theirs on you. Especially not on them. Because that is the only thing that breaks the cold for good. When Cora opened her eyes, the hardness was gone from them. She reached down, and she took her sister's frozen hands in her own cracked ones. "You're safe," she said quietly. "Come into the fire, Vera. You're safe." And she heard, around her in the crowded cave, a sound she would never forget. The sound of 24 people letting out the breath they had been holding. She brought Vera in. She warmed her, slow, the same way she had warmed all the others. No more gently, no more harshly. The same. And it was only later, when the worst of the cold had left her sister's body, that Vera began in a broken whisper to tell the truth. It wasn't the way he told you, Vera said. Her voice shook. Pell, he came to us with papers, said there were debts on the family ground. Old debts from before that we'd none of us known about. Said if we didn't sign, we'd all of us lose everything. Said the only way to save any of it was to... She could not look at her sister. Was to let you go, she finished, so quietly it was almost lost. He made it sound like there was no other way, like it was you, or all of us. Her voice broke entirely. He lied to me, Cora. He lied to all of us. There were no debts. I found that out after. He just wanted the water and the cliffs, and he knew you'd never sell. And he knew the rest of us were too scared and too poor to see what he was doing. He used us. He used me. To get rid of you. She finally turned and looked at her sister, and her face was a ruin of shame. I told myself I was saving the family, she whispered, but I sold my own blood to a liar. And then the storm came, and the only roof I could think to run to was yours, the one I helped take from you. God help me. The only place I knew I might be safe was the place I helped put you out into the cold to build. Cora was silent for a long time. She did not say it was all right, because it was not all right, and they both knew it, and cheap forgiveness would have been an insult to them both. But she kept her sister's hands in hers, and she did not let go. We'll talk of it, she said at last, when the storm's done. There'll be time then, for all of it. She squeezed the cold hands once. For now, you're warm, and you're alive. And that's the part that has to come first. It was the deepest hour of that third and worst night that the cave faced its true test. The old man, the one who had followed the smoke. He had been failing slowly all through the long ordeal, and now, in the small hours, he took a sudden turn. His breathing went shallow and strange. His skin went a color that frightened everyone who saw it. He grew confused, then still, then frighteningly hard to wake. A young woman who had taken to helping Cora cried out, "He's going! Somebody do something! Warm him up, quick! Put him by the fire!" And hands reached for the old man, to drag him to the flames, to do the thing every frightened instinct screams to do. No! Cora's voice cracked across the cave like a whip. Everyone froze. "You'll kill him," she said, lower now, moving fast to the old man's side. "Bring him to the fire like that, and the cold blood in his arms and legs will rush all at once to his heart, and it'll stop. I've seen it. Heat is not the same as healing. Now everyone, back. Give him air, and do exactly as I say." And in the firelit dark, with 24 frightened souls watching, the woman they had all once written off went to work. She did not move him to the fire. She had warm stones brought, wrapped in cloth, and laid them not against his hands or his feet, but against the center of him, his chest. So the warmth would build slow from the core outward, the way her grandmother had taught her, the way the old shepherds in the old country had kept the dying alive through nights like this one for longer than anyone could remember. She had warm, not hot, water held to his lips, a few drops at a time. She kept the cold hands and feet still, and would let no one rub them, no matter how it frightened them to wait. And she talked to the old man the whole long while, low, steady, a river of quiet words, telling him to stay, telling him the spring was coming, telling him he was not alone in the dark and would not be left there. The cave was utterly silent, but for her voice and the storm. The young woman wept without making a sound. Elias stood guard so no panicked hand would undo Cora's careful work. Vera watched her sister with an expression that had no name, and the little girl, Wren, woke and watched too, her small hand finding Cora's sleeve again. It took hours, in which the old man hung between the warm world and the cold one, and no one knew which way he would fall. And then, near the very turning of the night, in the hour when the dark begins at last to thin, the old man stirred. He drew a breath that was deeper than the last, and another. The terrible color began slowly to leave his face. His eyes fluttered and opened and found the faces gathered above him. Cold, he managed. Awful. Cold. And a young woman laughed and wept at the same time. And somewhere an old voice said, "Thank God," under its breath. And a kind of trembling joy went through the whole crowded cave, like warmth through frozen blood. He would live. The old man would live. He drifted then, half waking, half in fever, his lips moving as the warmth crept back into him. "Names," he murmured, to no one, to the firelight. "I knew them all once, all the old names, the ones that came first to this country." And then his head settled, and his breathing slowed into sleep, and no one in that crowded dark made anything of it. Cora sat back on her heels, every bone in her body aching, more tired than she could remember being in all her long life, and she became aware, slowly, that the cave had gone quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. She looked up, and she found them all looking at her, the people of the valley, the ones who had laughed, the ones who had turned their backs at the trading post, the ones who had let her be put out into the cold without a single word raised in her defense. And her sister. They were all of them looking at her, and there was no laughter in their faces now, no scorn, none of the easy contempt that had followed her out of the valley and into the rocks. There was something else. It was the look people get when they have been wrong about someone for a very long time, and have just, in a single terrible night, been shown the whole size of how wrong they were. No one spoke. No one made a speech. The valley was not a place for speeches. But the old man, whose life she had just pulled back from the dark, reached out one shaking hand toward her, and Cora took it, and he held on, and his old eyes were wet. And that was all. And it was everything. The recognition came not in words, but in silence. In the way every soul in that cave looked at the discarded woman in their midst, and saw, at last, exactly what she was. Not a foolish old widow who'd gone to die in a hole. The only reason any of them would live to see the morning. Outside, the storm screamed on through the last of the dark, but inside the warm stone, something had shifted, and it would never shift back. Cora rose, slow, her knees protesting, and she moved among them once more, checking, tending, never resting. The little girl Wren followed at her side, holding a fold of her sleeve, and the woman who had been left to die before winter moved through the heart of her own creation, surrounded on every side by the very people who had cast her out. All of them alive, all of them warm, all of them kept from the cold by the hands they had once thought worthless. She pressed her palm once to the patient stone of the wall. "Hold," she whispered to it. And the stone held. And so did she. The storm broke at dawn on the fourth day. It did not end all at once. The great ones never do. The roar that had filled the world for 3 days and nights simply began, somewhere in the deep of that last darkness, to lose its conviction. The wind grew tired. The driving white softened and slowed, and at last fell still. And then there was silence, a vast, ringing, unfamiliar silence after so long with the roar. Cora was the first to notice it. She had not slept. For 3 days she had held the whole fragile world of that cave together by will alone, and she had forgotten what quiet sounded like. Slowly, so as not to wake the child sleeping against her side, she rose. She crossed the floor between the sleeping bodies of the people she had saved. She reached the entrance, and she drew the cover back, and the light came in. After 3 days of that sick gloom, after the endless screaming white, the morning light fell into the cave like something holy. Cora stepped out onto the ledge. The world had been made new. The whole land lay under a deep and flawless blanket of white, unbroken from the foot of the cliffs to the far hills that had reappeared, clean and sharp, against a sky washed to a pale and tender blue. The sun stood low and golden, and where it touched the new snow, the whole vast plain glittered as though scattered with a million small fires. It was so quiet. It was so still. It was so beautiful that it stopped her breath. Cora stood alone on the ledge, an old woman wrapped in a worn coat, and she looked out over a world that had tried, with everything it had, to kill them all, and had failed. Behind her, in the warm dark of the stone, 24 souls slept on, alive, every one of them alive. Breathing the warm air of a shelter built by a pair of hands the whole valley had thrown away. And Cora felt something she had no name for. It was not triumph. She was too tired for triumph, and too old, and she had learned long ago that triumph was a young person's feeling. It was something quieter, the deep, still peace of a woman who has been tested past her own believing, and has not broken. She did not weep. She only stood there and breathed the cold, clean air, and let the golden light fall on her lined and weathered face. And after a while, a small hand slipped into hers. She looked down. Ren had woken and come to find her, and now stood beside her at the edge of the new white world, looking out at it with the wide, solemn eyes of a child who has seen too much and survived it. "Is it over?" the little girl asked. Cora looked out at the shining land. "This part is," she said, and she held the small hand, and together the old woman and the child watched the sun climb over the made new world. But peace, Cora knew, was only ever a borrowed thing. Somewhere down in the valley, behind warm walls, a man in a fine coat was waiting out the thaw, and the law he believed he had bought and paid for. The storm was beaten. The man was not. Not yet. In the days that followed, the cave slowly emptied. The snow was deep, but the storm was past, and one by one the people began to make their way back down toward the valley, toward homes they could only hope were still standing. But it was not the same going as the coming had been. They did not slip away like strangers. They left like people who had shared something they would carry for the rest of their lives. The freighter took Cora's hand in both of his and held it a long moment and could not find the words. In the end, simply nodded. And that was enough. The two young brothers chopped a great stack of wood before they left, more than they had burned, repaying the warmth with their own strong backs. The young woman who had wept over the old man embraced Cora at the door, hard and sudden, the way you hold someone you have decided to love. And the old man himself was the last of them to be well enough to travel. And when at last he did not go right away. He sat by the fire, this thin old fellow with the kind, tired eyes, and he watched Cora work, and one evening he said to her, quietly, "You know who I am, what I was before I got old and useless?" Cora shook her head. "I kept the records once," the old man said, "in this country, years back when it was all just being settled, the claims, the deeds, the filings. Nobody thinks much of an old record keeper, but there's not much about the land in these parts that ever got written down that didn't pass under my eyes first." He smiled faintly. "I told you that bad night, half out of my head. I knew all the old names, the ones that came first." "I remember," Cora said softly. She had thought it only fever. "And here's the thing, missus. I've been lying here, getting my strength back, thinking on it. About these cliffs. About this stone. About the name the others keep saying. Whitlock." Cora's hands went still. "What about it?" she said. The old man's eyes were sharp now, for all his age. "There was a claim," he said slowly, "an old one. The first homestead filed in all this country. Filed by a woman, which was rare enough to remember in those days. A widow, come from the old country, with nothing but her hands, and her hard sense. She didn't take up the soft bottomland the others fought over. She took up these cliffs, that creek, the only deep water for a day's ride. Everyone laughed at her for it." He paused. "And she never let it go. Never sold it. Never abandoned it. The claim was good, and it was filed proper. And by every law there is, it would have passed straight down her own blood." Cora had gone very still indeed. "Her name," she whispered. "Do you remember her name?" The old man looked at her with something gentle in his face. "It was the same as yours, missus," he said. "Your grandmother. It was your grandmother's land. This whole place. It was hers, and the law never said otherwise." He did not have to finish. Cora sat down slowly on the stone floor of the cave she had built. The cave her grandmother had once told her stories about, by candlelight, in a kitchen that no longer stood. The old woman who had taught her that earth remembers warmth. The old woman who had stood once on this very ground, with nothing but her hands and her hard sense. Cora pressed her palm to the cold stone, the way she always did, and for the first time, the steadiness she had always felt in it made a different kind of sense. She had not stumbled onto a forgotten place to die in. She had come home. She had come, without ever knowing it, back to the one piece of earth in all the world that had been waiting for her, that had been hers, in blood and in law, all along. "He doesn't know," Cora said softly. "Pell, he doesn't know about the old claim." "No," said the old man. "I'd wager he doesn't. A man like that buys up the paper that's easy to find, and he never goes digging for the paper that's hard. Why would he? He never imagined anyone would be left to fight him." His old eyes glinted. "But the records are still there, missus, gathering dust. And an old man who used to keep them still remembers right where to look." Spring came slow that year. the way it does after a hard winter. The snow melted off the high places first, and the creek swelled and ran loud and cold below the cliffs, and the first green things pushed up through the brown, and the land that had tried to kill them all softened and forgave and began again. And on a morning when the air had turned at last from cold to merely cool, the horses came back. Cora heard them before she saw them, the crunch of hooves, the creak of fine saddle leather, the low, easy voices of men who had eaten well that morning. She did not feel the cold fear she had felt the first time. She stepped out from the cave, and she stood at the mouth of her stone, and she watched August Pell come picking his way up the slope toward her, 2 hired men at his back and a roll of papers in his gloved hand. And this time, she was not alone. For the valley had not forgotten the winter. Word of what had happened in the cliffs had spread through every home, carried by every soul she had saved, told and retold at every hearth until it had become the only story anyone wanted to hear. The story of the woman they had thrown away, the woman who had opened her door to the ones who had shut theirs, the woman whose worthless old hands had been the only thing standing between 24 people and the cold. And so, when the word went round that August Pell was riding up to the cliffs to put that woman off her land at last, the valley came too. They came up the slope behind him, on foot, in their worn boots and their mended coats. The whole hard, scattered people of that country, gathering quiet behind the man who meant to do the throwing. Pell did not seem to notice them at first. He drew up before the cave, and the same cruel, almost smile came to his face. "Still here," he said. "I confess I'm surprised. I rather expected the winter to have finished our business for me." "The winter and I came to an understanding," Cora said. Pell unrolled his papers with a flourish. "Well, it hardly matters now. The deeds are drawn. The land is mine, all signed and sealed, these cliffs and that water along with the rest. So you'll gather your things, woman, and you'll be off my property by your property." It was not Cora who said it. It was the old man. He stepped out from the mouth of the cave to stand beside her, thin and bent and leaning on a stick, but with his old eyes sharp as flint. And in his free hand he held papers of his own, old papers, yellowed and brittle and soft at the folds with age. Pell's smile flickered. "And who," he said, "are you?" "A man who used to keep the records," the old fellow said pleasantly. "All of them, including the ones you never bothered to look for, Mr. Pell, because you never imagined you'd need to." He held up the yellowed papers. "This land was claimed," he said, "filed, proven, lawful, and complete, long before you or your easy money ever came to this country, claimed by a widow, off the old homestead law, fair and square, the cliffs, the creek, the water you mean to put a price on. And that claim was never sold, and never abandoned, and never extinguished." His voice grew hard. "Which means it passed, by every law there is, straight down to her blood." He nodded toward Cora, "To the woman standing right there, the one you tried to clear off like brush." A silence fell over the slope. Pell's face had changed. The easy contempt was draining out of it, and something else was coming in behind it. The first cold touch of fear. That's nonsense," he said. "Some old scrap of paper. It wouldn't hold. The deeds I have." "The deeds you have," said the old man, "are built on the lie that this land was empty and unclaimed. They'd come apart the moment anyone laid this old claim beside them. And I'll lay it beside them, Mr. Pell, in front of anyone who cares to look. I know exactly which dusty shelf the truth is sitting on." He smiled gently, terribly. "Do you really want to start pulling on that thread, with the whole valley watching?" And then another voice spoke, clear and steady and unafraid. "The claim's blood," said Vera, "and blood is shared." She stepped forward out of the crowd, pale but straight-backed, and she came to stand beside her sister. It came down to the two of us then, to me as much as to her. She turned so the whole valley could hear her. "So let it be witnessed by all of you. Whatever share of it is mine, I sign it over to my sister, here, now, every inch. I took enough from her already, more than a body can pay back. This stone is hers. The water is hers. It always was. I'll not let any man, nor any law he thinks he's bought, say otherwise." She looked, then, not at Pell, but at Cora. "It's the one thing I've got left to give you," she said quietly. "Take it, please." Cora looked at her sister for a long moment and did not speak, but she reached out and she took Vera's hand, and she held it there, in front of them all. And that was answer enough. Pell looked from the old man, to the two sisters standing joined, to the brittle truth held up in the morning light. And then, at last, he turned in his fine saddle and saw the rest of them, the people behind him, the whole hard, scattered population of that country, standing quiet on the muddy slope, watching him. And there was nothing soft in their faces, nothing afraid. These were not the cowed and frightened folk he had so easily used before. These were people who had been to the edge of the cold and back, and had been pulled back from it by the very woman he meant to throw away. They knew her now. They knew what she was. And they knew, looking at him, what he was. "You lied to us," said a voice from the crowd. And then another took it up, and another. "There were no debts, Pell. You made them up. You used us." A low murmur ran through the gathered people, a sound of agreement, a sound almost of warning. August Pell sat his fine horse on the muddy slope, with the brittle old truth held up in one direction and the whole watching valley standing in the other, and Cora saw the moment he understood that he had lost. Not to a gun, not to a fight, to something far older and far stronger than either, to a community that had decided altogether what it would and would not stand for. For a moment the cruelty came back into his face, the urge to bluster, to threaten, to find some way to win. But there was nowhere for it to go. A man can buy a great deal in this world, but there are some things that, once a person has shown the whole valley exactly what he is, no amount of money will ever buy back. Pell rolled up his useless papers. "This isn't finished," he said, but his voice had lost all its weight, and everyone there heard it go. "It is, though," Cora said quietly. "It's finished. You just don't like the shape of the ending." And August Pell turned his fine horse, and he rode away down the slope, his two hired men trailing after, through the gathered crowd that parted just enough to let him pass, and not 1 inch more. And the people of the valley watched him go, and nobody laughed, and nobody cheered. They had all of them learned that winter that some victories are too serious for cheering, They simply watched the cruel man ride away small into the distance, and then they turned, all of them, to look at the woman whose land it had been all along. The land was hers now, truly, lawfully, beyond any man's power to take. The cliffs, the creek, the stone she had made into a home. By every right, Cora could have closed her door at last, could have lived out her years in the warm shelter she had built, secure and alone, owing nothing to anyone, least of all to the people who had once cast her out. No one would have blamed her for it. But that was not what she did. She stood on the ledge a few days after Pell had gone, and she looked down at the valley spread below her, and she made a different choice. This stone kept 24 souls alive this winter, she said to Elias, who stood beside her. And there'll be other winters. There always are. There always are, Elias agreed. A shelter like this, it shouldn't belong to one person, Cora said slowly, working the thought out as she spoke it. It shouldn't sit empty most of the year, warming nobody, just because it has a name on a paper. That's not what it's for. She looked out at the land. It should be open. To anyone the cold drives up here. Anyone caught out. Anyone lost. Anyone with nowhere else to go. It should be the place people know they can always reach. The one door that's never shut. Elias was quiet a moment. Folks'll say you're a fool, he said, giving away the use of the only thing you own. Cora smiled a little. Folks have said worse about me, she said, and they were wrong then too. So that is what she did. She made the cave a shelter for all of them, a common refuge kept ready against the hard nights, stocked and warm and waiting, for whoever in that country might one day need it the way she had once needed it, and find nowhere else to go. And she did one thing more. She did not keep the secret. The knowledge her grandmother had given her, the old wisdom from the old country, the trapped air and the patient stone and the slow fire and the rule about warming a frozen thing slow. She had carried it alone all winter, like a treasure she alone possessed. But a treasure that only one person holds, she had come to understand, dies with that person. And she had buried enough of that this winter. The worn boot beneath the old cloth. The stranger who had built and planned and saved, and left a gift in the dark, and taken all the rest of what they knew into the silence with them. She would not let the knowing die with her too. So through that spring, and the summer that followed, the people of the valley came up to the cliffs, not fleeing this time, learning. Cora taught them. She showed them the double walls and the trapped air between. She showed them how to set a hearth of fitted stone that would drink the fire and give it back all night. She showed them how to read the sky, the way her grandmother had taught her, and how to feel a great storm coming in the bones before ever it showed itself on the edge of the world. And she showed them, most carefully of all, the slow way, the only way, to bring a frozen body back to life without killing it in the saving. The young ones learned it fastest. The young woman who had wept over the old man learned it so well that the next winter she would save a life of her own with it, far across the valley, and would weep again, this time with the wonder of it. And so the knowledge spread from one old woman's hands out into a whole hard country, the way wisdom is meant to spread, the way it had come down to her in the first place, from grandmother to mother to a girl too young to listen, passed on, refusing to die. The thing with Vera was harder. It did not heal all at once. It did not heal cleanly. The wound her sister had dealt her was too deep for that, and Cora was too honest a woman to pretend otherwise. There were no grand reconciliations, no tearful speeches that fixed everything in an afternoon. Real things between real people do not mend that way. But Vera kept coming back. All through that spring, she came up to the cliffs, and she worked. She hauled stone and packed clay and helped ready the shelter for the winters to come. And she asked for nothing, and she did not try to talk her way back into her sister's heart. She just kept showing up. And one evening, late, when the work was done, and the two of them sat tired by the fire, Vera said quietly, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't think I'd forgive me if I were you. I just want you to know I'll spend whatever years I've got left trying to be worth forgiving, whether you ever do or not." And Cora looked at her sister across the fire, at the gray in her hair, at the lines of the hard road she'd walked too, at the shame she carried and would go on carrying and was not asking to be let off from. "I don't know if I've forgiven you," Cora said slowly. "That's the honest truth of it. Some days I think I have. Some days the old anger comes back so strong it frightens me." She looked into the flames. "But here's a thing I learned this winter, Vera. You don't have to feel forgiveness to choose mercy. The choosing comes first. The feeling catches up in its own time. Or it doesn't. But you make the choice either way." She reached across, and after a moment, she took her sister's hand. "You're my blood," she said, "and the door stays open, even for you. Especially for you. We'll see what grows from that. No promises, but the door stays open." And Vera wept then, quietly, and held her sister's hand by the fire, and it was not everything, but it was a beginning. And after a winter like that one, a beginning was a great deal. As for the child, nobody ever came for Wren. The kin she had been traveling with were never found, lost somewhere out in that terrible white. And as the spring wore on, it became plain that the little girl had no one left in all the world. No one, that is, except the gray-haired woman whose sleeve she would not let go of. It was never spoken of as a decision. It simply became true, the way the deepest things do. Wren slept in the warm cave and ate at Cora's table and followed her everywhere and learned everything and called her, after a while, by a name that was not quite mother and not quite anything else, a name that was only theirs. And Cora, who had once stood in a cold doorway believing she had nothing left to give, who had buried the last of her old life in a gold ring traded to a freighter on an empty road, found that her life was not, after all, over. That it was, in fact, only changing shape. She was too old to have taken in this child. The world would have said so. The world had said she was too old for a great many things. The world had been wrong about all of them. On a warm evening late in that first spring, Cora sat with Wren at the mouth of the cave, the two of them watching the sun go down gold and slow over the green and living land. And the child, who had been quiet a while, said, "Tell me again, the thing about the stone, why it stays warm." Cora smiled, and she tapped the rock beside her, the way an old woman had once tapped a kitchen table in a house that no longer stood, in a story handed down through women across more years than anyone could count. Wood freezes, child, she said softly. Burns up fast, and then it's gone, and you're cold again. She pressed her old palm flat against the patient stone. But Earth remembers warmth. You give it heat slow, and it holds it. And long after the fire's dead and gone, the stone keeps giving that warmth back to you, like a gift it had been saving all along. The little girl pressed her own small hand against the rock beside Cora's. Earth remembers warmth, she repeated, solemn, learning it. That's right, Cora said. Don't you forget it. And one day, when you're old, and there's a child beside you who needs to know, you tell them. You pass it on. That's how it stays alive. That's the only way anything stays alive. And the child nodded and pressed her hand to the warm stone and looked out at the gold and fading light. That is where the story leaves them. Not at a triumph, not at a grand and shining ending with all the wounds healed clean and all the debts paid in full. The winter had cost too much for that. The gold ring was gone and would not come back. The years that had been stolen from her were stolen still. The forgiveness between two sisters was a slow and uncertain thing, planted but not yet grown. Some cold, once it gets into a person, never fully leaves. That is the truth of it. That is the bittersweet at the heart of every real healing. But the woman who had been left to die before winter did not die. She lived. And more than that, she made a place where others could live too. A warm door in a cold country, kept always open, for anyone the dark might drive to it. If a traveler crossed that land now, in the deep of any winter, and looked toward the line of pale cliffs against the white, they would not see one thin thread of smoke rising lonely from the rock, as there had been that first hard year. They would see many, column after column of warm gray smoke, rising from shelters all along the cliffs and out across the valley, from 100 hearths of fitted stone laid by hands that had learned the way, each one a small, warm fire held safe against the cold, each one a door that would open to a knock in the night, a whole country that had learned from one discarded woman how to keep each other warm. And somewhere among them, in the oldest shelter of all, in the stone that had been her grandmother's, and was now hers, and would one day be a child's, an old woman sat by her fire, with a little girl learning at her side, content. Not because the world had finally decided she was worth something, but because she had known all along, in the deepest and quietest part of her, that her worth had never been the world's to decide. It never is. It never was. Earth remembers warmth. And so, in the end, did she.